Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, we're going to talk about the biggest question regarding the Timberwolves roster and really the rotation this season. We'll talk about the training camp roster breakdown. Training camp starts, media day is actually 1 week from today. Training camp starts a week from Tuesday. We'll also talk about the one word to describe the Wolves offseason, spurred on by Bleacher Report, with a weird adjective to describe the Timberwolves offseason, to describe their summer. We'll talk about that on the show today as well. It's all upcoming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to us by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets, guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Happy Monday, everybody. Hopefully you had a fantastic weekend. Today, I want to get into a couple different things. I want to start with kind of the biggest question facing the Timberwolves as we enter training camp. I mean, 1 week from today is media day. 1 week from Monday is media day. 1 week from Tuesday, October 1st, is the first day of training camp for the Wolves. The first preseason game is 1 week from this Friday, October 4th. Believe it or not, it is right around the corner. So biggest question facing the roster and the rotation. We'll talk about the overall kind of roster, where it sits right now and how the end of the roster could support that question mark, that I guess kind of maybe soft spot in the depth chart as we head into training camp. And then we'll close by talking about an adjective to describe the Timberwolves summer. We'll get to all of that here on the show today. A big thank you off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. All right. So I think without question, the number one question about the Timberwolves season this year is what does this bench unit look like, and who is the straw that stirs the drink off the bench for the Timberwolves? Now, a little over a year ago, the Timberwolves signed Shake Milton. It was not my favorite move of the offseason for the Wolves. I came around to it preparing for the season last year because I understood what the Timberwolves were trying to do. They were trying to find somebody who could provide some punch off the bench, could both provide help encourage production for others, initiate offense for others, but also score themselves and also be a good catch and shoot player off the bench for the Timberwolves. And plus, in addition to all that, somebody who had a bit of playoff experience, some big game experience. The idea was that Shake Milton could provide that punch from the jump. In preseason even, Shake never looked comfortable in the Timberwolves uniform. And it just never happened. 30-plus games for him. He ended up being traded at the deadline. And not a true point guard, more of a scoring guard in a big point guard's body, more of a combo guard, but he was never a sharpshooter. He wasn't a plus, passer, a plus playmaker for others. And he never was able to create his own shot with the Wolves. It was something he could operate for himself out of pick and roll when he was the ball handler and he was the one who used the possession and tried to score. He was effective doing that in Philly prior to coming to Minnesota, but it never happened with the Timberwolves. So the Wolves ended up trading for Monte Morris at the deadline, trading out Troy Brown Jr. and Shake Milton and saying, like, hey, we'll just go traditional point guard, somebody who's a better three-point shooter, somebody who can catch and shoot from three. And he shot the three great in Minnesota uniform. He was a step slow defensively. Of course, he never fully recovered from that quad injury he suffered early in the year in Detroit last season. And he was fine, but he didn't provide quite the level of impact that the Timberwolves needed from him. Jordan McLaughlin was a bit up and down as well, but again, more of a traditional point guard, didn't have the size the Timberwolves prefer. And also that kind of, McLaughlin's a fine defender and was better than Monte Morris defensively last year. The lack of size and combined with he couldn't create for himself other than catch and shoot threes, really. That punch wasn't there. And layer on top of that, Mike Conley being 37 and Max having 2 years left in the league and the Timberwolves being over the second apron, the only way that you could find a point guard of the future is through the draft. And of course, the Timberwolves trading a bunch of picks for Rudy Gobert previously. And also being as good as they are, they knew that their picks upcoming are going to be in the 20s. So how do you do it? You trade up, you get a guy at number 8 and Rob Dillingham. The plan A going into this season is Rob Dillingham is the scoring punch off the bench. It's weird because they have the reigning sixth man of the year, Naz Reid, but Naz is more of a he's not initiating, right? You're not dumping the ball to him in the post. He's going to get the ball in the perimeter, pump fake and get to the basket, right? He's going to face up. He's going to score out of face up situations, score in transition, catch and shoot threes, all of the above. And he's super effective, but he's not the one bringing the ball up the floor. And you're not just having, Nickeil Alexander-Walker dribble the ball up before, dump it to Naz in the post. That's not how the Timberwolves offense operates. They need somebody who can orchestrate pick and roll, who can run a break into a secondary break into some sort of half-court action to get an open three for Naz Reid, or to get an open three for Karl-Anthony Towns, or to get Rudy rolling to the basket, or to create an advantage for somebody else that's on the floor. But in addition, somebody who can also create for themselves. Because again, while Naz can create in a face-up situation on the perimeter, if stuff breaks down, you're not relying on Naz Reid to go get us a bucket. That's not plan A, B, or C for the Timberwolves. And if one of Cat or Ant is on the bench, then say Ant's on the bench, Cat's getting double teamed on the catch because there's nobody else that's a threat on the floor. How else are you going to score? So they needed to find somebody who could not only orchestrate the offense off the bench and create shots for others as a pure point guard would do, but also someone who could be a threat to score themselves. And when the ball swings back to them, because the defense is loading up on Cat or Ant or Naz, knock down a wide open three, or pump fake and get to the basket, or get to a floater themselves. Enter Rob Dillingham. That's plan A. Rob Dillingham, shot 50% essentially on catch and shoot threes. It's 48% on 88 attempts last year at Kentucky, catch and shoot threes. Off the dribble threes, 38%. He's a good off the dribble shooter from everywhere. So creating for himself, he's effective. He's efficient. He's a fantastic pick and roll player. He was a 50% shooter as the ball handler out of pick and roll last year at Kentucky, 43% on threes out of pick and roll as the ball handler, more than a point per possession overall as a pick and roll ball handler. Really good feel in the half court. Reads pick and roll coverage as well. Makes the right decision more often than not for a guy who is, going to be 19 this year. There's really no question about his offensive ability. All of the numbers are positive. There's nothing bad about Rob Dillingham, what he did. Some of the turnovers sometimes, but freshman point guard, right? He didn't even start the majority of the season. I think he started one game last season for Kentucky. Came off the bench. Creative, good playmaker, fantastic shot maker, extremely good catch and shoot, good off the dribble from everywhere, great as a pick and roll ball handler, pretty good floater, didn't shoot it a ton, loves using his change of pace in the half court, all of the above. The only concern for him offensively is the size. He's 6'1", 6'3" wingspan, but he's 100, he was measured at the combine or in the pre-draft process at 164 pounds, which is extremely light for a guy who's 6'1", for anybody that plays the NBA. I don't care how tall you are. That's the only question mark. Can he finish through contact? Can he muscle through defenders that are going to be in his way? Can he hold up over the course of an NBA season? Now, he's not going to be taking the ball to the rack and trying to score over and around guys as much. He's going to be going to that floater, or he's going to be pulling up and shooting from the mid-range. I mean, he does that pretty well, or he's going to be shooting threes. But the point is he could do all of the above. Shake Milton, there was never, obviously, the ceiling at this point in Shake Milton's career, but there was never, what was the best case with Shake? He was going to score 8 points a game off the bench, and he could do everything. Nothing was great, right? He wasn't a great three-point shooter. He wasn't a great passer. He wasn't great. He was above average at, the idea was, scoring for himself off the dribble. Rob Dillingham should be good to great at all of the above. Catch and shoot, orchestrating the offense, getting off a floater, scoring off the dribble, beating somebody one-on-one. He's obviously not as big as Shake Milton. That's really the only drawback, and of course, the lack of experience. All the concerns related to Rob Dillingham are defensively, and I don't want to focus on that as much today, but Shake wasn't a good defender either. So if Rob Dillingham can at least put forth the effort to fight through ball screens defensively, he's going to be able to stay on the floor. That's what the Wolves coaching staff is going to ask of him. And they're going to say, hey, look, we have enough good defenders, both Rudy on the back line, protecting the paint, and all these other guys that can step in and cover. If you fight through these screens and at least give us your best, we're going to be just fine. And you're going to get to play. Now that's where the, plan B, plan C come in. Is if Rob Dillingham doesn't, and he's so bad defensively that then you have to have somebody else. What's the next plan? Who steps up next if Rob Dillingham isn't the guy, or if he gets hurt, God forbid, because he is so slight and there's going to be the wear and tear of the NBA season. He gets knocked to the floor a couple of times. Could that add up very quickly? A guy who only played 1 year in college. I want to get to what plans B and C would be for the Timberwolves and maybe even beyond that. in terms of the really effectively the point guard, or as I like to say, the straw that stirs the drink off the bench for Minnesota. We'll do that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors over at FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start this season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. When you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets over at FanDuel. Sundays are the best time for that. There's actually, if you're listening to this on Monday, there's 2 Monday Night Football games tonight. So go check those out while you're watching the Monday Night Football games. 2 of them. So you could go multi-view, YouTube TV or whatever, or you got multiple TVs. I mean, like this is the chance, right? Right before basketball actually starts next week, you'll start to get preseason action on your TVs. This is your chance. Multiple Monday Night Football games. If you miss doing this on Sunday with FanDuel, of course, next Sunday, do the same thing with FanDuel. Again, if you get a hunch in the middle of the game, live betting, etc., check out the latest stats, live play-by-play, and more on the same page where you can place your bets at FanDuel. Get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Again, a $5 bet gets you $200 in bonus bets guaranteed over at FanDuel. That's FanDuel.com. Big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen of the day. Now, for your second listen, go enjoy the Locked On NBA podcast. There's no offseason in the NBA. Locked On NBA provides daily basketball analysis from national and local experts in 30 minutes or less. No one keeps you as informed and entertained as Locked On NBA. Available on YouTube or wherever you get podcasts. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Side note related to Locked On NBA, I'm scheduled to be on the show on Monday with Jackson Gatlin, who's also the host of Locked On Rockets. We're going to talk a little NBA expansion, which we touched on about a week ago here on this show. But go check out Monday's episode. The plan is that I'll be joining Jackson to talk about that from a Wolves perspective. So go check out Locked On NBA wherever you listen to podcasts. All right. So plan A, Rob Dillingham should be the backup point guard, should be the straw that stirs the drink off the bench for the Timberwolves. What's the backup plan to that? Well, what was the backup plan last year when Shake Milton was ineffective? It was Nickeil Alexander-Walker, number 1. He probably is plan B. I would also put Joe Ingles in that same category. Just as last year at times it was Kyle Anderson. It was a little bit matchup dependent. It was a little bit what else the game called for. If the game was going to require more perimeter defense based on the opponent who was on the floor for the opposing team, Nickeil Alexander-Walker was the guy. He was the guy who would see more time with the ball in his hands in the half court, or at least the ball in his hands with the Wolves were on offense, initiating, orchestrating, etc. Now, not looking to score as much on his own, and that's kind of the thing, is like, yeah, Nickeil can knock down an open three, and certainly did that last year better than he had at any point in his career, but he wasn't trying to score off the dribble as much. That's something that early in his career he tried to do in New Orleans, tried to do in Utah. Like, that was the idea, was this guy coming out of the draft could do these things. The Wolves haven't asked him to overextend himself. They've said, hey, look, your role's defense, your role's knocking down open threes. It's basically a 3-and-D role, but he can also be a big point guard if they need him to be. Similarly, Joe Ingles, obviously a very different player, but similar in role, in that Joe Ingles is going to be in that Kyle Anderson role offensively, the Swiss Army knife offensively, where mostly we just need you to be ready. Like, Kyle Anderson obviously wasn't knocking down catch and shoot threes, at least not this last year. And certainly, never in his career at the volume of what Joe Ingles should be doing. Joe Ingles ran a lot of offense for Orlando last year, was very turnover prone. Kyle Anderson also, as we talked about, I think it was Friday's show, we talked about how Kyle Anderson was actually the biggest culprit for the Wolves in terms of turnover rate last year. But Joe Ingles should plug and play, replace that role for Kyle Anderson. And I would say he's every bit the threat off the dribble, pick and roll wise, as Kyle Anderson was. Now, Kyle Anderson is more likely to try and get, back to the basket, make a post move, or shoot the weird little 8, 9, 10 foot push shot that he likes to shoot. Joe Ingles isn't going to do that very often. He's not going to get to the rim very often at all, but he is a really good passer out of pick and roll, whether it's to the roller. Him and Rudy have great chemistry. That's obviously one of the things that factored into the Timberwolves signing Joe Ingles, but also kicking out to the perimeter for another shooter. Like, Joe Ingles is going to keep the defender on his hip and keep his options open for passing the rock. He's not going to take it to the basket himself. It's a very different way to run an offense than Nickeil Alexander-Walker, but just as Kyle Anderson was the zone buster last season for the Wolves, it became, as the season went on, teams played less and less zone against the Wolves, probably in part because they kind of figured this out with Kyle Anderson. Joe Ingles is likely going to be that guy. He's going to stand at the nail, be right in the middle of the floor, and the Wolves will throw the ball into Joe Ingles and he'll distribute to others. That's kind of plan B is the combination of Alexander Walker and Joe Ingles in different ways being that initiator for the bench unit. Now, Anthony Edwards, of course, belongs probably in a similar category because not ideal. But if Cat's off the floor and Ant's on the floor, and by the way, Chris Finch, I thought this was a miss last year at times. I don't think the Wolves often enough played where those guys' minutes were really truly staggered. Like I believe now this isn't as big of a deal when you're playing the Portlands of the world or whatever, the Portlands, the Detroits, like teams like that. You should be able to win without this. But to always have one of those guys on the floor, especially against good opponents, makes a lot of sense to me. And if, say, Ant's off the floor, Cat's on the floor, ideally, Rob Dillingham's on the floor running offense. But if Cat's off the floor and Ant's on the floor, you're basically running the offense through Ant anyway. So then it makes sense to have guys who can now all the above can catch and shoot. Rob Dillingham, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Joe Ingles, Dillingham and Ingles should be, above league average 3-point shooters, and I'll be right around that or hopefully a little bit better. Then Ant's the one with the ball in his hands anyway, and he's creating for himself and kicking to open 3-point shooters. Like it's really in that sense, it would just be, or in that situation, I guess it would be really more of a pick your poison type situation. So Ant, could certainly end up, even if he's on the floor with the starters and Mike Conley's usually running the offense, as we know, the ball ends up in Ant's hands more often than not. That could also be the case with the bench unit too. So it maybe matters a little bit less. Like it's less of a talking point. Who's the backup point guard? Like they need a backup point guard. If you go listen to a random national podcast, that may be a concern for the Wolves. I wouldn't call it a concern as much as a question. And that's why I phrase it this way on today's show. It's a roster/rotation question. How will the Wolves handle this? I'm not really worried about the personnel. I talked last week about Zach Lowe on the Bill Simmons podcast, talked about the Wolves only have 7 guys that you can really trust. Well, I don't know about that. Like I know Joe Ingles is old. I know Rob Dillingham's a rookie. But they both, like the most likely scenario is they're both positive contributors, at least offensively. Could there be some slippage defensively? Sure. But you have the defensive player of the year. You have a second team all defensive guy in Jaden McDaniels. You have capable team defenders in Mike Conley and Karl-Anthony Towns and Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Like, I think that I don't worry about this depth issue, this depth question. I don't think it is an issue, really. It's just something to watch. And then the break glass in case of emergency situation here. Daishen Nix, of course, on a 2-way contract. We'll talk more about him when we do roster previews here soon. And then to a lesser extent, even PJ Dozier. Actually, I could mention Dozier first because he's on a partially guaranteed deal, whereas Nix is on a 2-way deal. So PJ Dozier is the 14th man right now, and that he's on a standard NBA contract, but it's partially guaranteed. So he's owed $1 million. January 6th, that thing turns into a fully guaranteed deal, which is still vet minimum, so it's a little over $2 million. But basically, if they cut him at any point between now and January 6th, they still owe him $1 million. So he's very unlikely to go anywhere. And while he's more of a wing, he's ran some offenses before. Clearly, Tim Conley really likes him, and he could get a shot at essentially being a point forward type for the Timberwolves. If there was a like, hey, Dillingham's hurt or ineffective, depending on the matchup, maybe Ingles is resting on a back-to-back or whatever. PJ Dozier is an option. And then once we hit January 6th, then the rest of his contract becomes guaranteed the rest of the year. And then the last guy in camp, the last 2 guys in camp that are both on Exhibit 10 deals, Skylar Mays, who played for Portland and the Lakers last year. I did a whole show. I guess it was almost a half show. I talked about Mays specifically last week. We'll talk more about him in the future to do, if you want to hear a full breakdown of who he is. But he's essentially a combo guard, played really well in some stints for Portland over the last couple of seasons, spottier playing time with the Lakers second half of last year. He'd be an option. And then Chasen Randall, who hasn't actually officially signed, or at least hasn't been announced by the team, but it's been reported that he's on an Exhibit 10 deal, would be the last guy in camp. And he's also a combo guard who's ran some offenses before internationally, G League, and also in the NBA. So both options at the way end of the bench for Minnesota, if disaster was to strike, are also guys that we might see running the offense a bit in the preseason as well this year. So names to keep an eye out for. Real quickly, I want to do like a quick breakdown of where the roster sits right now, and then we'll roll into this offseason adjective that was I wanted to talk about this because of what I saw over at Bleacher Report. So we'll do that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. All right, quick roster breakdown, and we'll circle back to this too, but I want to make sure that we're kind of level setting here as we head, again, 1 week away from Media Day. Timberwolves roster breakdown right now, they only have 13 standard fully guaranteed contracts. We know who those 13 are. It's the starting five. It's the first three off the bench, which of course is Naz Reid, Alexander Walker, and Rob Dillingham in some order. And then you've got past draft picks. Well, the other draft pick from this year, Terrence Shannon, who's probably like the 9th or 10th guy. And then you have past draft picks, Leonard Miller and Josh Minot. And then also Luka Garza is now on a standard contract. That's 13 guys. They have one non-guaranteed, or I should say partially guaranteed standard contract. That's the aforementioned PJ Dozier, who's the 14th guy, guaranteed for $1 million through January 6th. January 7th would be the date where they've got to make the decision. And then two-way contracts, second-year guy, Jalen Clark, second-round draft pick, of course, didn't play last year with the Achilles, played in Summer League, defense first guy. Again, we are going to break down each player individually for a player preview here, probably starting later this week. Jesse Edwards, undrafted rookie out of West Virginia, played 4 years at Syracuse, 1 at West Virginia. He's a very light version of Rudy Gobert, defensive-minded, rim-running, roll big there on a two-way deal. And then Daishen Nix, who was on a two-way deal last year for Minnesota. He would be, I guess, the de facto third point guard if you're looking at just true point guards on the roster. He's also in a two-way deal. And then the Exhibit 10 guys who we've talked about. There's 4 of them. 3 have been confirmed by the team. Jaden Ledee, Skylar Mays, and Eugene Omoruyi. And then the 4th one, who's not confirmed by the team, but was reported like almost 2 weeks ago now, is Chasen Randall, who I talked about last segment. That's 21 total guys. 4 Exhibit 10s, 3 two-ways, 1 partially guaranteed deal, and then 13 standard fully guaranteed contracts. That is the training camp max of 21 contracts. There's always a chance at this point that Chasen Randall, it fell through or falls through or something, and maybe he's not in and they pick somebody else. And then a reminder, they're very unlikely to carry the full six. Remember, it's a 16-man roster plus the 3 two-way deals. They currently have 14 if you lump in PJ Dozier. They're pretty unlikely to sign 2 guys because they're over the second apron. I think the most likely scenario is they move forward with 14. At some point when they have to get to 15, they'll sign somebody like they did last year with Justin Jackson, and then they did it with TJ Warren, and then they ended up signing Warren and Luka Garza for the rest of the season. Expect that to be similar where the Wolves pick guys up in the middle of the season. Maybe they fully guarantee PJ Dozier, but I guess even then they would still need to add at least 1 guy, and then by the end of the year, 2 guys to get to that 16-player limit. Per NBA rules. So not a whole lot of movement likely there, but it's something we'll keep an eye on and we'll revisit as we go through the player preview series. I want to close today by looking at Bleacher Report, did an article, 1 word to describe every NBA team's offseason. Okay, this is Eric Pincus, who of course used to be, I think, at Hoops Hype, does a good job overall. I like Eric Pincus. This is a classic like mid-late September. Hey, we got to preview the season in a creative way. Let's put some content out there. Let's do this. Let's describe every offseason with one word. Some of them are hyphenated words. Some of them have question marks on them and other punctuation. So he was creative with it. The 1 word for the Timberwolves surprised me because you would think coming off a Western Conference Finals berth with a guy who is an ascending star over, Eurobasket a couple years ago, or excuse me, the World Cup a couple years ago, Olympics this last year, Conference Finals appearance, all NBA second team, 2-time All-Star now in Anthony Edwards, that it would be like ascending or ascendant or breaking through. I guess that's 2 words. Or breakthrough, 1 word. Make it 1 word. Something like that. Something more positive. But instead, the word that Eric Pincus at Bleacher Report picked for the Timberwolves is limbo. I'll read what he wrote about the Timberwolves. He says, the Minnesota Timberwolves had a successful 23-24 campaign on the court. Behind the scenes, this franchise is pushing through an ugly ownership dispute with Glenn Taylor, Alex Rodriguez, and Mark Lowry. The team's decision-making may be stifled as Taylor goes through the legal process with Rodriguez and Lowry. Timberwolves have 2 significant extensions starting the season, Ant and Jaden, and are one of the NBA's largest taxpayers. If that's going to change, it may not be until the ownership limbo is resolved. Okay. So yeah, if we're specifically talking about the ownership situation, limbo is fine. But if you're talking about the organization, like regardless of how that thing turns out, we covered this last week on the show. Like it's possible some changes are made if say Taylor wins. It's possible he says, all right, you got to trade guys, but he's the majority owner now. Like I don't think that this season will be defined by the ownership struggle at all. I think it's the summer and next season and beyond that will certainly this ownership thing will have a massive impact on that. But I don't think this season, like we saw this last year, this was still a distraction. This whole thing started to happen in March. And if you don't talk about distractions, there's that. And Chris Finch talked about how it wouldn't, what was the phrase he used? It wouldn't trickle down to troop level, I think is what he said. And it didn't. It didn't impact the guys on the court. It didn't impact the coaching staff. Chris Finch breaks his kneecap or whatever. He tears the patellar tendon in the playoffs, and that doesn't, they still advance. They finish off Phoenix. They advance through Denver in 7 games, and obviously conference finals disappointing. But like all these other distractions have not been enough to completely sidetrack Minnesota. So I don't know why this would in season. So I think if we're defining the season or even the offseason, because that's the other thing, is if this word is defining the offseason or describing the offseason, nothing changed. Like sitting here right now on September 23rd, it's the exact same situation that we were in on May 2nd. As soon as mediation didn't solve it on May 1st, nothing's changed other than us knowing that November is when arbitration is going to happen. So I think it's kind of a silly, too easy word, which isn't even accurate to describe the offseason and also the upcoming season. If you want to talk about specifically the ownership situation, great. It is in limbo. But the team itself, the organization, the upcoming season, the offseason, none of that. I would say it's still ascendant. I would say it's still on the cusp of a breakthrough if it hasn't already broken through. There's certainly reasons to be concerned. And I think it starts and ends with how good the Western Conference is. And you could say that the offense, even like middle is 16th isn't good enough if they're going to win a title. How will it improve when the only thing you really did is add some shooting in the form of Dillingham and Ingles and jettison somebody who couldn't shoot in Kyle Anderson? That's positive, but will it lift like we've talked about all this stuff before. I just think limbo is a really weird word to use otherwise. And I don't think it really describes the offseason overall, the team overall, the organization overall going into the season. I just don't think it fits. Some of the other ones maybe do a little bit more, and some of them are kind of goofy. Like, I don't know, like the Thunder's is ready. Like why? I get it. The Thunder had a big offseason. They won 57 games. They lost in the second round and are like, I like Caruso and Hartenstein, but like, are they going to like all of a sudden is this team like, what are they ready for? Are they ready to go to the conference finals? Because the Wolves already did that last year. Anyway, it's a weird exercise. So I don't want to pile on too much, but I just think like it's a weird word to use for the Timberwolves. All right. That's all we got for you today. Again, training camp starts a week from tomorrow. Media day a week from today. We'll get into player previews this week. What I'll do is we'll go from the bottom of the roster up. We'll talk Exhibit 10 guys. We'll talk two-way guys. Then we'll get into standard contract guys. Depending on the player, some shows I may do like 4 players. Like I'll probably do all the Exhibit 10s together. I already kind of previewed them as they were signed. So we'll do one show with just kind of recapping who these guys are because we'll see them in preseason. We'll see reports on them in training camp. So it's important to understand who they are and if they've got a shot or are they just Iowa Wolves guys or none of the above. We'll talk two-way guys. And then we'll get into, as we get into the rotation, we'll probably do more of like a half show on a player. And then as we get into the starting lineup, we'll probably do a full show on each player. And I'll talk about like, hey, what do we expect Karl-Anthony Towns to do this year based on last year? Based on what he did last year, what can we expect or want or need from him this year for the Timberwolves? We'll do that with each of the starters here. That'll probably be into next week. Leading into the first preseason game, which is a week from Friday on October 4th at the Lakers. All right. That's all we got for you today here on the show. Big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. Of course, you can also follow an X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Thanks again for making us your first listen. A reminder that for your second listen, you go find Locked On NBA, where the local experts keep you updated daily on all the biggest storylines ahead of the season. Find Locked On NBA on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast. We'll catch you next time.